So, you think you've heard about corruption? You see the headlines, you hear the politicians pointing fingers, and you think, okay, I get it, people steal money. But what if I told you that some leaders didn't just steal money? They stole the future. They took the hopes and dreams of entire nations and turned them into personal shopping sprees. Today, we're not just talking about a few bad apples. We're counting down the top 10 most corrupt presidents in Africa. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it's about understanding a system that has held back a continent brimming with potential. Corruption in Africa isn't a simple story of greed. It's a complex web that strangles development, poisons politics, and leaves ordinary people paying the price. Imagine a country rich in diamonds or oil, but its people can't get clean water. Imagine hospitals without medicine because the budget vanished into a foreign bank account. This is the reality that corruption creates. It's the invisible tax on every citizen, the unseen barrier to progress that keeps nations in a cycle of poverty and instability. It's a story that needs to be told, not for blame but for understanding. So, buckle up. We're about to go on a journey through lavish palaces built on public funds, secret bank accounts holding billions, and legacies of leaders who saw their countries not as a home to nurture but as a personal treasure chest to plunder. This isn't just a list, it's a series of cautionary tales. It's a look at how power, when unchecked, can lead to a continental-scale catastrophe. And maybe, just maybe, by shining a light on these stories, we can understand how to prevent them from happening again. Let's get into it. Alright, let's kick things off with a man who didn't just dabble in corruption, he turned it into an art form. I'm talking about Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. This guy was the living, breathing definition of kleptocracy, which is a fancy word for a government that exists purely to steal from its people. And boy did he steal. He ruled for over 3 decades, from 1965 to 1997, and in that time he treated the national treasury like his personal ATM. He wasn't subtle about it either. This wasn't some sneaky, under-the-table dealing. This was prime-time, in-your-face, I'm-taking-it-all kind of theft. Imagine this. Your country is one of the richest in the world in terms of natural resources, cobalt, diamonds, copper, you name it. Yet, your people are among the poorest on the planet. Where did all that wealth go? Well, a lot of it went into Mobutu's pockets. We're talking estimates of anywhere from $5 billion to $15 billion. With that kind of money, you could fund the entire continent's healthcare for a year. But no, Mobutu had other plans. He bought palaces in Europe, chartered Concorde jets for shopping trips to Paris, and built a personal airport next to his jungle palace big enough to land that Concorde. He had a flair for the dramatic, I'll give him that. He famously said, "If you want to steal, steal a little cleverly, in a nice way. Only if you steal so much as to become rich overnight, you will be caught." The irony is, he stole so much he became one of the wealthiest men in the world, and for a long time, nobody stopped him. Why? Because during the Cold War, he was the West's guy in Africa, a bulwark against communism. So, while his people suffered, and the country's infrastructure crumbled, international powers often looked the other way. His lavish lifestyle was legendary. He owned a fleet of Mercedes-Benz cars that he would fly between his various palaces. He had vineyards in Portugal and castles in Spain. Meanwhile, back in Zaire, the roads dissolved into dirt tracks, the hospitals ran out of medicine, and the saying went that civil servants had to fend for themselves, which was code for go get your own bribes because we're not paying you. He didn't just take the money, he took the system with it. The scale of his corruption was so immense that it fundamentally broke the country. He created a culture where graft was not just common, but necessary for survival. He pitted ethnic groups against each other to maintain power, ensuring that while everyone was fighting amongst themselves, no one was looking at the man at the top who was emptying the vaults. It was a masterclass in destructive leadership. When he was finally overthrown in 1997, he left behind a nation in ruins, a legacy of debt, and a blueprint for how to systematically dismantle a country for personal gain. Mobutu Sese Seko isn't just number 10 on a list. He's the benchmark against which other kleptocrats are measured. He set a standard for grand corruption that, unfortunately, many others would try to follow. Now, if Mobutu was the flamboyant showman of corruption, our next guy, Sani Abacha of Nigeria, was the silent, shadowy figure who operated like a mafia boss. He was a military general who seized power in a coup in 1993 and ruled for just 5 years, until his death in 1998. But in that short time, He orchestrated one of the most audacious and systematic thefts of state funds in modern history. He wasn't about the flashy lifestyle in the same way Mobutu was. He was about cold, hard cash, moved with military precision. Abacha's method was brutally simple. He and his cronies would basically just tell the Central Bank of Nigeria they needed money for national security projects. These requests were often just handwritten notes. A note would go to the bank, and trucks filled with cash, dollars, pounds, Deutsche Marks, would leave. No paperwork, no oversight, just the boss needs money. Estimates of how much he stole vary, but the Nigerian government itself has stated it's in the realm of $5 billion. That's $1 billion for every year he was in power. This wasn't just domestic theft, it was a global operation. The money was laundered through a complex network of banks in London, New York, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. They used shell companies, fake identities, and complicit financial institutions to hide the money. It was so widespread that for decades after his death, countries around the world have been playing a game of find the Abacha loot. Every few years you'll see a headline, Switzerland returns another $300 million of Abacha's money to Nigeria. It's the gift that keeps on taking. And while he was funneling billions offshore, what was happening in Nigeria? The country, a major oil producer, was falling apart. Refineries were failing, leading to massive fuel shortages. People would queue for days just to get gasoline. Hospitals and schools were neglected. His regime was also incredibly brutal. He crushed all dissent, executing activists, including the famous writer Ken Saro-Wiwa, which turned Nigeria into an international pariah. He wasn't just stealing the money, he was silencing anyone who dared to speak up about it. Think about the sheer audacity. At one point, his national security advisor, Ismaila Gwarzo, personally took $1.45 billion in cash from the central bank. He told the bank that Saddam Hussein was planning to invade, and they needed the money to bribe other West African leaders to form a coalition against him. It was a complete fabrication, a story made up on the spot to justify emptying the vault. It sounds like a bad spy movie, but it was real, and the Nigerian people paid for it. Sani Abacha's legacy is a stark reminder of how military dictatorships can provide the perfect cover for grand-scale corruption. With no democratic accountability, no free press, and a rule enforced by fear, he had free rein to treat Nigeria's oil wealth as his personal piggy bank. The fact that nations are still recovering the stolen money over 2 decades later shows just how deep and damaging his looting truly was. Next up, we have a man whose time in power was so long, he saw the invention of the internet, the rise of smartphones, and the entire Fast and Furious franchise. I'm talking about Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, who ruled for 30 years, from 1989 until he was ousted in 2019. 30 years is a long time to be in charge, and it's also a very long time to be accumulating wealth and power through questionable means. His story isn't just about money, it's about how corruption fueled conflict and international crimes. When al-Bashir was finally overthrown, the images were stunning. Protesters raided his residence and found suitcases stuffed with cash. We're talking over $130 million in various currencies just sitting there in his house. It was like a scene from Narcos, but instead of a drug lord, it was the head of state. And that was likely just the tip of the iceberg. The real corruption was embedded in the system he built over 3 decades, a system that controlled every profitable sector of the Sudanese economy. His government operated what many have called a shadow state, a network of loyalists, military officials, and businessmen connected to his party, controlled everything from oil exports and gold mining to telecommunications and agriculture. If you wanted to do business in Sudan, you had to play by their rules, which usually meant giving a cut to the right people. This system enriched a small elite while the rest of the country struggled with poverty, sanctions, and war. And let's talk about the war. Al-Bashir is a man wanted by the International Criminal Court for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Darfur. Corruption was the engine of this conflict. The government armed militias not just with state funds, but by giving them control over local resources. It created a system where violence was profitable. You control a village, you control its land, its water, its trade routes. This wasn't just a political conflict, it was an economic one, driven by a corrupt regime in Khartoum. The international sanctions imposed on Sudan because of the Darfur conflict and its support for terrorism created a perfect environment for even more corruption. Legitimate trade was difficult, so a black market economy thrived, controlled, of course, by the regime's insiders. They were the only ones who could move money and goods in and out of the country. and they charged a premium for it. The sanctions, meant to punish the regime, ended up making its key players even richer. So when you look at Omar al-Bashir, you see the complete picture of how corruption rots a country from the inside out. It's not just about stealing money, it's about using that stolen wealth to maintain power, using that power to crush dissent, and using that control to fuel conflicts that tear the very fabric of society apart. The suitcases full of cash were just a symptom of a much deeper disease that plagued Sudan for 30 years. Imagine a country that is, per capita, one of the richest in Africa, wealthier than many European nations. Now imagine that the vast majority of its people live in extreme poverty, without access to clean water or basic health care. Welcome to Equatorial Guinea, the personal fiefdom of our next president, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo. He's been in power since 1979, making him Africa's longest-serving leader. And in that time, he and his family have made the country's oil wealth their personal family fortune. The story of Equatorial Guinea is a classic resource curse tale. In the mid-1990s, massive oil reserves were discovered offshore. Suddenly, one of Africa's poorest countries was swimming in petrodollars. Did this translate to better lives for its citizens? Absolutely not. Instead, it funded a lifestyle for the ruling family that would make a Bond villain blush. The line between the state treasury and the Obiang family's bank account isn't just blurry, it's non-existent. The most famous example of this is Obiang's son, Teodorin Obiang, who he appointed as vice president. This guy's spending habits are honestly legendary. We're talking about a $30 million mansion in Malibu, a fleet of luxury cars including Bugattis and Ferraris, a private jet, and millions spent on Michael Jackson memorabilia, including the crystal-studded glove. Where did he get this money as a government minister with a modest official salary? Well, French, Swiss, and American authorities have all concluded it was stolen directly from his country. The corruption is systematic. Government contracts for construction, infrastructure, and oil services are routinely awarded to companies owned by the president or his relatives. Foreign oil companies operating in the country are often required to partner with these same firms, ensuring a steady stream of kickbacks and profits flow directly to the ruling family. It's a closed loop of enrichment, completely sealed off from the general population. Meanwhile, the people of Equatorial Guinea suffer from some of the worst human development indicators in the world. The UN has reported that a significant portion of the country's children are malnourished. Hospitals lack basic supplies. The capital, Malabo, has gleaming new government buildings and hotels, but just a few blocks away, people live in shacks without sanitation. The contrast is not just stark, it's a deliberate outcome of a system designed to concentrate wealth in the hands of one family. Teodoro Obiang has run the country with an iron fist, crushing any opposition and maintaining absolute control. He once had state radio declare him a god who is in permanent contact with the Almighty. When you believe you're a god, the concept of public funds probably seems a little quaint. For over 4 decades, he has presided over a system that treats an entire nation's resources as his birthright, creating a surreal paradox of immense wealth and desperate poverty. Our next story is, honestly, a tragedy. It's about a man who started as a celebrated liberation hero, a champion of independence, and ended as a caricature of a dictator who clung to power while his country crumbled around him. This is the story of Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. He ruled for 37 years, from 1980 to 2017, and his journey from hero to villain is deeply intertwined with corruption and economic mismanagement that bankrupted a nation once known as the breadbasket of Africa. In the early years, Zimbabwe was a success story. It had a strong economy, good schools, and a functioning healthcare system. But as Mugabe consolidated his power, things began to change. The corruption started subtly, with patronage and rewarding loyalists with government positions and contracts. But it escalated dramatically in the late 1990s and early 2000s with his controversial land reform program. The program was meant to correct colonial-era imbalances in land ownership by taking farms from the white minority and giving them to landless black Zimbabweans. In principle, it was a noble idea. In practice, it was a catastrophic exercise in cronyism. The best farms weren't given to experienced farmers, they were handed out to Mugabe's political allies, generals, and cronies who had no idea how to run them. Agricultural production plummeted, triggering the collapse of the entire economy. This economic collapse created a perfect storm for hyperinflation and corruption. As the Zimbabwean dollar became worthless, we're talking about $100 trillion notes that couldn't buy a loaf of bread, those with access to foreign currency, namely US dollars, became kings. A small, politically connected elite got rich through illicit diamond mining, illegal foreign exchange deals, and by controlling the import of scarce goods like fuel and food. While the majority of Zimbabweans were dealing with empty shelves and an unemployment rate that topped 80%, Mugabe and his inner circle lived in luxury. His wife, Grace Mugabe, became known as Gucci Grace for her extravagant shopping sprees in Europe and Asia. The family was reported to have vast properties and business interests both inside and outside Zimbabwe. They were literally fiddling while Harare burned. The system was built on fear and patronage. The security forces, the police, and the judiciary were all stacked with loyalists who benefited from the corrupt system. Any challenge to Mugabe's rule was met with violence and intimidation. Elections were marred by allegations of rigging and voter suppression. It was a government that had ceased to serve its people and existed solely to perpetuate its own power and enrich its leaders. Mugabe's legacy is a painful lesson in how even the most promising revolutions can be devoured by the very greed and lust for power they fought to overthrow. For nearly 4 decades, from 1979 to 2017, José Eduardo dos Santos ruled Angola, a nation blessed and cursed with massive oil wealth. Like Obiang in Equatorial Guinea, dos Santos presided over an oil boom that generated hundreds of billions of dollars. And also like Obiang, that wealth largely bypassed the Angolan people and was concentrated in the hands of a powerful few, most notably, his own family. His rule was less about flamboyant personal spending, and more about creating a sophisticated state-level system of enrichment. Under dos Santos, the state oil company, Sonangol, became a parallel state. It was more powerful than most government ministries, and was the primary vehicle for funneling money to the elite. Contracts for everything related to the oil industry, from exploration and drilling to security and catering, were controlled by a small circle of people connected to the president. This created a system where billions of dollars in oil revenue were never accounted for in the national budget. The IMF once reported that a staggering $32 billion had simply gone missing between 2007 and 2010. The most prominent beneficiary of this system was his daughter, Isabel dos Santos. During her father's rule, she was appointed head of Sonangol, and through a series of incredibly lucrative and often dubious deals, became Africa's first female billionaire. Leaked documents known as the Luanda leaks revealed how she was able to acquire stakes in Angola's key industries, telecoms, diamonds, banking, cement, often through presidential decrees signed by her father that gave her an unfair advantage. This was corruption on an industrial scale. It wasn't just about taking cash, it was about twisting the entire legal and economic framework of the country to benefit one family. While Isabel dos Santos was buying luxury properties in London, Lisbon, and Dubai, and hosting lavish parties, more than a third of Angolans were living in extreme poverty. The capital, Luanda, became one of the most expensive cities in the world for expatriates, yet most of its residents lived in sprawling slums or museques without basic services. The Dos Santos regime perfected the art of opaque governance. The national budget was a mystery, the dealings of the Sovereign Wealth Fund were secret, and any journalist or activist who tried to investigate was met with intimidation or worse. This lack of transparency was crucial. It allowed the looting to continue for decades, hidden behind the facade of a booming post-war economy. When Dos Santos finally stepped down in 2017, his hand-picked successor, João Lourenço, surprisingly began an anti-corruption campaign targeting the Dos Santos family itself. Isabel has had her assets frozen and faces investigations in multiple countries. It was a stunning turn of events that exposed the sheer scale of the plunder that had occurred. The story of José Eduardo dos Santos is a powerful example of how nepotism and state capture can divert the wealth of an entire nation into the hands of a single family. If you thought some of these leaders were strange, you haven't met Yahya Jammeh of the Gambia. This guy was, honestly, a whole other level of bizarre. He seized power in a coup back in 1994 and ruled for 22 years with this wild mix of brutal repression, outlandish claims, and systematic theft. He wasn't just corrupt, he was an eccentric dictator who treated the Gambia, the smallest country on mainland Africa, Pretty much like his personal playground and piggy bank, Jama's claims were, well, legendary. He declared he could cure AIDS and infertility with a secret herbal concoction, a claim that was not only false but, dangerously led people away from proper medical treatment. He insisted on being called His Excellency Sheikh Professor Al-Haji Dr. Yahya Ajj Jame Babili Mansa, with Babili Mansa meaning chief bridge builder or conqueror of rivers. This wasn't just ego. It was really part of building a cult of personality that allowed him to do whatever he wanted without question. And what he wanted to do mostly was steal. A commission of inquiry set up after he was finally forced from power in 2017 found that he had looted at least $362 million from the state. For a tiny, impoverished country like the Gambia, that amount is just catastrophic. He did it in all sorts of ways. He had direct control over state-owned enterprises like the National Telecom Company, and would simply order them to transfer money to his personal accounts. He also had his hands in every major business sector. He controlled the timber trade, taking illegal wood from Senegal's Casamance region and exporting it through the Gambia's port for personal profit. He had a fleet of planes, including a Boeing 727, and a collection of over 100 luxury cars, all paid for with state funds. He built numerous palaces and farms across the country, often on land seized from ordinary citizens. He was the state, and the state's assets were his. His rule was also marked by extreme paranoia and brutality. He created a paramilitary hit squad called the Junglers that answered directly to him. They were responsible for the torture, disappearance, and murder of countless journalists, political opponents, and anyone he perceived as a threat. He once threatened to cut off the head of any gay person in the country. This climate of fear ensured that his corruption went unchallenged for years. When he surprisingly lost the 2016 election, he initially refused to step down, plunging the region into a crisis. It actually took the threat of a military intervention by neighboring West African countries to finally force him into exile in Equatorial Guinea, hosted by none other than Teodoro Obiang. He left behind a treasury that was not just empty, but deeply in debt. Yahya Jammeh's reign is a chilling example of how absolute power, combined with eccentricity and greed, can terrorize and bankrupt a small nation. Our next leader is a master of political survival. Paul Biya has been the president of Cameroon since 1982, making him one of the longest-ruling non-royal heads of state in the world. His time in power has been characterized not by dramatic headline-grabbing theft, but by a slow, grinding, systemic corruption that has become deeply embedded in every layer of Cameroonian society. He's less of a hands-on plunderer and more of an absentee landlord, presiding over a system that runs on graft while he spends extended periods of time abroad. Biya is famous for his private stays in Geneva, Switzerland. An investigation by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, or OCRP, found that he had spent at least 4.5 years, on private visits outside of Cameroon since coming to power. These trips, often to the 5-star Intercontinental Hotel in Geneva, cost taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. While he was relaxing in luxury, his country was facing growing crises, including an armed conflict in its Anglophone regions. The corruption in Cameroon under Biya is pervasive. It's known locally as Faymania. Transparency International consistently ranks Cameroon as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Getting anything done, from obtaining a birth certificate to clearing goods at the port, often requires a bribe. Government positions are seen as opportunities for self-enrichment, creating a culture where public service is secondary to personal gain. This system is held in place by a powerful network of patronage. Biya maintains his grip on power by appointing loyalists to key positions and allowing them to enrich themselves, as long as they don't challenge his authority. Every now and then, he launches a supposed anti-corruption drive, known as Operation Sparrowhawk, which sees a few high-level officials arrested. However, critics argue this is just political theater, a way to eliminate potential rivals, rather than a genuine attempt to clean up the system. The consequences of this endemic corruption are devastating. Despite being rich in oil, timber, and agricultural resources, Cameroon's development has stagnated. Infrastructure projects are often overpriced and poorly executed due to kickbacks. The healthcare and education systems are underfunded. A significant portion of the national budget seems to vanish into a black hole of mismanagement and embezzlement each year. Paul Biya's long rule demonstrates a different style of corrupt leadership. It's not about the direct, personal looting of a Jammeh or an Abacha, It's about creating and sustaining a political and economic environment where corruption is the norm, the very oxygen that the system breathes. He has perfected the art of staying in power by letting the system rot from within, ensuring his own survival while the nation's potential withers away. Let's go back in time a bit to the first president of Côte d'Ivoire, Félix Houphouët-Boigny. He ruled from independence in 1960 until his death in 1993. He's a complex figure. For many years he was hailed as the Sage of Africa, a wise elder statesman who presided over the Ivorian miracle, a period of remarkable economic prosperity. But this miracle was built on a foundation that also included incredible state largesse and a blurring of the lines between his personal wealth and the nation's finances. Houphouët-Boigny's corruption wasn't the brutal, thuggish kind. It was sophisticated, paternalistic, and extravagant. He believed that the wealth of the country, which was the world's leading cocoa producer, was his to distribute as he saw fit. He used state funds to build a vast network of patronage, rewarding loyalty, and co-opting potential opponents with money, jobs, and favors. He famously said, "Peace is not an empty word, it is a behavior." And for him, that behavior often involved spending money to keep everyone happy and loyal. The most jaw-dropping symbol of his extravagance is the Basilica of Our Lady of Peace in his home village of Yamoussoukro. In the 1980s, as the price of cocoa collapsed and Côte d'Ivoire fell into economic crisis, he spent an estimated $300 million of, he claimed, his own money to build the world's largest church, a near-exact replica of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, complete with Italian marble and French-stained glass, right in the middle of the African bush. Even if it was his own money, how does one man accumulate that kind of fortune while leading a nation? He made Yamoussoukro the new political capital, spending billions to build a presidential palace with a private lake filled with crocodiles, a massive convention center, and grand empty boulevards. This was all happening while the economic capital, Abidjan, was struggling with the fallout from the economic downturn. The spending was so immense and so concentrated on his home region that it created deep resentments that would contribute to the country's instability after his death. His philosophy was that money that stayed within the country, even if spent lavishly, was not truly corruption. He saw it as circulating wealth. However, a significant portion of the country's earnings from cocoa and coffee exports were managed through a state marketing board called the Heist, which was notoriously opaque. Billions of dollars flowed through it over the decades with little public accountability, funding everything from infrastructure projects to the president's political machine. Félix Houphouët-Boigny represents a different era of African leadership, the founding father who saw himself as the nation personified. His corruption wasn't about hiding money in Swiss banks, it was about spectacular public displays of wealth and power that were meant to project the glory of both himself and his nation. But in the end, this system of personalized rule and lavish spending left Côte d'Ivoire with massive debts and deep political divisions that would explode into conflict after he was gone. Finally, we come to Idriss Déby of Chad. He ruled the desert nation from 1990 until his death on the battlefield in 2021. Déby was a soldier first and a president second. He came to power through an armed rebellion and spent his entire 30-year rule fighting off other rebellions. In this environment of perpetual conflict, corruption and military spending became two sides of the same coin. For Déby, national security was the ultimate justification for a lack of transparency and the diversion of state funds. Chad became an oil-producing nation in 2003, and there was hope that the new revenues would lift the country out of its extreme poverty. The World Bank even brokered a unique deal that required a portion of the oil money to be set aside for development projects in health, education, and infrastructure. It was meant to be a model for how to avoid the resource curse. But it didn't take long for Déby to break the agreement. As soon as the oil money started flowing, Déby's government changed the law to allow for the funds to be used for security. In practice, this meant buying weapons, funding the military, and enriching a small circle of his military and political allies, many from his own Zaghawa ethnic group. The promised development projects never fully materialized. The oil wealth, instead of building schools, was used to buy tanks and fighter jets to keep him in power. The corruption was deeply tied to the military-industrial complex he created. Arms deals were notoriously opaque. State contracts were awarded to companies controlled by his family and inner circle. The National Oil Company was a black box, with revenues disappearing into off-budget accounts. This was a system designed not for national development, but for regime survival. For ordinary Chadians, life remained incredibly difficult. Chad consistently ranks at the very bottom of the UN's Human Development Index. Life expectancy is one of the lowest in the world. Access to clean water, electricity, and healthcare is a luxury for most. The oil boom that was supposed to be a blessing turned out to be just another source of wealth for the ruling elite to consolidate their power and fight their wars. Idris Deby was a key Western ally in the fight against terrorism in the Sahel region. His army was seen as one of the most effective in the region, and for that reason, international partners, particularly France, often turned a blind eye to the rampant corruption and democratic backsliding in Chad. It created a situation where stability, or rather the absence of total collapse, was prioritized over good governance and the well-being of the Chadian people. His legacy is a country armed to the teeth but starved of development, a testament to how the geopolitics of security can enable and sustain corruption. So there you have it. 10 leaders, 10 stories of immense wealth and squandered potential. From Mobutu's leopard skin hat and Concorde jets, to the intricate offshore networks of the Dos Santos family, the pattern is tragically clear. The stories we've heard today aren't just history, they are a devastating account of how corruption on a grand scale acts as a boot on the neck of development. It's the single greatest obstacle to Africa's progress. It's not about a lack of resources, but a lack of accountability for those resources. It turns oil booms into curses and mineral wealth into a source of conflict. This isn't just an African problem, it's a global one. The money stolen from these nations doesn't just disappear. It flows through international banks in London, New York, and Geneva. It's hidden in luxury real estate in Malibu and Dubai. It's laundered by a network of lawyers, accountants, and bankers who enable this plunder. Fighting corruption in Africa also means demanding more transparency and accountability from our own financial institutions in the West. It requires a global effort to close the loopholes that allow this stolen wealth to be hidden. The fight against corruption is long and difficult, but it's not hopeless. Across the continent, journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens are risking their lives to expose graft and demand change. New leaders are launching investigations and recovering stolen assets. The key for all of us, no matter where we live, is to stay informed and pay attention. Understand these stories, share them, and support the organizations that are working on the front lines, because a less corrupt world is a more prosperous and just world for everyone. Thank you for watching.